Give everybody a moment to start signing in. All right, welcome to preview week for Willamette, the Pinot Noir auction. The wines featured in this tasting series are small lot bottlings for our exclusive trade auction. Contact Emily at the WVWA, and I'll drop her email address in the chat if you don't know about the auction and you'd like to learn more. For this year's auction, we're pleased to announce a charitable partnership with the James Beard Foundation's Food and Beverage Investment Fund for Black and Indigenous Americans as a part of their Open for Good campaign. All funds raised on auction lots beyond the opening bids, as well as through the paddle raise pledge, will go to the investment fund, and I'll drop the link for their website in the chat as well. I also want to take a moment to thank our auction sponsors for their ongoing support. And now I'd like to introduce today's featured panelists. Representing lot number 20, Drew Voit of Elizabeth Chambers Cellar. Representing lot 21, David Adelsheim of Adelsheim. Representing lot 23, Bill Sweat of Winderlea Vineyard and Winery. And representing lot 26, Andy McVayof of Dobbes Family Estate. And now I'd like to kick it off to our moderator, Jessica Endsworth of Northwest Wine Company. Jessica, take it away.
Hey guys, hello. Welcome to the 5th annual Willamette auction. We normally would be holding this in person in April, the first week of April. But with this year, we've decided to make a change and do this online. We're so glad you could join us today. We have an incredible panelists of winemakers, and we're so happy that you can be here. We're just going to get started here and talk a little bit about each lot, get to know you. We're excited to pair up with the James Beard Foundation this year as well, and introduce all these fantastic wines from the Willamette Valley. So we're going to do this in lot order so it's a little easier to follow. Julie is sharing the link for some resources if you want to go on to the Willamette Auctions site. There's some fantastic information about each lot, the harvest dates, and some more about background about the vineyards and the each individual lot, some technical information. But we have these incredible winemakers here today to tell you about each of their lots. So we're going to just say thank you for being here, and we're going to get started. We'll have a little time for Q&A at the end. So away we go. We're going to get started with our first winemaker, Drew Voit from Elizabeth Chambers, lot number 20. This is a 5-place lot called Nouveau Papillon from the Yamhill Carlton AVA. Drew, would you tell us a little bit about your lot?
Absolutely. So yeah, 5-case lot. It comes entirely from Lazy River Vineyard, which is one of the sites we contract fruit from and have for a number of years. I've been overseeing the winemaking at Elizabeth Chambers for about 2.5 years. The winery itself was founded in 2013 by the Chambers family who used to own Panther Creek and own another winery in the southern Willamette Valley called Sylvan Ridge. So it was under its second generation of Chambers woman ownership after Carolyn's mother passed the baton to Elizabeth or Liz. And we lost Liz about 2.5 years ago, prematurely, but the winery lives on in her name and is now under the control of her daughter, the third generation of Chambers women to run wineries going back to the late 1980s, early 1990s. So it's called Nouveau Papillon, New Butterfly. The winery label has always featured a butterfly that Liz designed in memory of her mother, and a second one was added to our label in honor of her. So from the terrific 2018 vintage and from the fairly cool and breezy Lazy River site, western side of Yamhill Carlton, 100% volcanic soils, which is actually pretty uncommon in Yamhill Carlton. So a very distinctive site that I think of really more as a coast range foothills site than a typical Yamhill Carlton site. And then in addition, we've been able to contract a fairly rare selection of Pinot Noir, the Mount Eden selection, a one-time Burgundian smuggled heirloom thing that found its home in parts of Northern California, and now is, I think, being investigated and tried up here fairly widely and to good success. Very, very complete, complex wine made from a single volcanic block.
That's awesome, Drew. Can you tell a little bit about the profile of this wine and kind of what are some of the highlights that you're really featuring and seeing in this taste profile?
Absolutely. Well, I think typical of the 2018 vintage, we've got a lot of concentration and a lot of power in these wines. They've got a lot of energy and a lot of tension. This wine is relatively dark fruited, but the Mount Eden clone, in my experience so far, from this side and the few others that I've worked with on it, shows a tremendous range of complexity, from some darker kind of blackberry, brambly sort of notes, with also a lot of fresh red fruit characters. And it reminds me quite a bit of the Pommard selection in that regard. That it's very complex and is a fascinating standalone clone. A selection that does a nice job. So a pronounced kind of rose petal tone, which I think is typical of that volcanic soil, with quite a range of ripe red into touches of darker, very caneberry kind of focused, raspberry into blackberry.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Drew. So that is 5K slot, lot number 20, Nouvelle Papillon, from Elizabeth Chambers. And we're gonna now move over to our friend David Adelsheim from the iconic Vineyard site and winery Adelsheim Vineyards, which was started in 1971. David, lot number 21, Still Brian on the Block, which I'm fascinated by this title, and a 5K slot. David, would you shine some light on your lot, please, this year?
Sure, absolutely. Still Brian on the Block is because we're all great fans of J Lo and her 2002 song "Still Jenny on the Block." Earlier, you wanted me to do my rendition of that song.
Still waiting for that.
No, not happening. But Brine Creek is the second oldest, well, really the third oldest in planting estate vineyard. It's right across the street from Quarter Mile Lane, the original vineyard. I think there's a picture shared right now set up. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. And this is Brine Creek Vineyard. This is the part that was first, including block 5, which is where my arrow is here, which is the rockiest and usually the ripest section of the vineyard. And in fact, this 2018 wine, the barrels that were collected and made into a 5-barrel lot for this wine were pretty ripe. Almost 24 bricks, 3.5 pH. And when you try the wine, because this is so high elevation, these grapes are about 730 feet above sea level in block 5 there. Even though they are ripe in terms of numbers, the wine is not ripe in terms of fruit. It is not jammy at all. It's still very fresh, very brambly, red fruit. And what I love about Gina's winemaking, Gina's been the winemaker since 2018, so she finished this wine, though she didn't pick it. What I love about her winemaking is the wines have returned to a smoothness and a broadness and a fleshiness without having any heaviness. It's really it's sort of a reflection of the original style that made the Willamette Valley famous back in the 80s and 90s when this vineyard was being planted. As I said, it's all the original Pommard clone. It's own rooted, which means particularly on a rocky soil, there are vines in this block that are dying from phylloxera, and eventually this whole block will be taken out.
Hey, David.
I think that's all I should do on this wine.
I have a question for you, David, too. Since you've seen so many vintages come through in the Willamette Valley, is the 2018 vintage, which all of these lots are sourced from, the 2018 vintage, is there anything that's reminiscent of another year that you would compare it to, or do you think it stands on its own?
You know, we have this conversation, and some people are pointing to 08 or 12 or even 99. I think the reality is, for those of us that lived through the vintage, it was a delightful vintage. It was a vintage that was warm but not hot through the whole summer. It didn't rain a substantial amount in September. The grapes were not ready early. They ripened in cool weather. you, in fact, had a certain amount of freedom to pick when you felt that the balance was what you were looking for. And in fact, Brine Creek, which is usually the last thing we pick because it's so high, we could kind of sit on it and wait until the very end of September before picking this. And I think the one thing I think we can all say with surety is that the wines from 2018 will age incredibly well. I mean, these wines will harken back to the wines of particularly the late 70s, early 80s, maybe even the early 90s before global warming really played a real role. And these wines will live for 25, 30 years easily, particularly wines like this that have a substantial acid background, reasonable tannins, even as they are very rounded.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David, for the description. And that is still Brian on the block, lot number 21.
It is still Brian on the block. Yeah.
Still Brian on the block from the Chehalem Mountains AVA 5K slot from Adelsheim. And we're going to go over to our friend, Mr. Bill Sweat at Winderlea. Bill, lot number 23, a 5K slot called On Its Own Roots from the Dundee Hills. Bill, would you tell us a little bit about your vintage and about the lot that you produced this year for us?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. So 2018 was a pretty nice vintage. It was, a little cooler, a little drier in the winter, got a little warm in the early spring. Things started to cool down during the growing season, but it was dry for the most part. So I think the vintage is not characterized so much by heat as it is by lack of water. And then September cooled down a bit, and we got a shot of rain about mid-month. And we picked the fruit for this on the 24th of September. So after we got a little cool weather and a little shot of water. This is from our home estate vineyard in the Dundee Hills, Winderlea Vineyard. It's from the oldest 3 blocks on the property, planted in 1974, 75, and 76. They're at the top of the vineyard, so in a really nice mid-slope position on Warden Hill Road in the Dundee Hills. This was picked at about 23.5 bricks. Fermentation was in 2, now 14-year-old Taranto oak fermenters. Kind of a cooler fermentation. It took about 5 days to get up to temperature, and then about 10 days for the fermentation to complete. And it was in the fermenter a total of about 21 days. The wine is a really pretty light garnet color. And I think maybe it's a little bit out of character for a lot of what I'm hearing for the vintage. Because I don't get the real concentration we're talking about here. It's still, I think, elegant and very red fruit driven, cherry, black cherry, cranberry with some lilac and orange blossom. And then in the mouth, the flavors echo that red fruit flavors, cherry and strawberry and black cherry with some nice orange zest and a little coriander spice. And then in terms of structure, the first impression I think you have is that it feels very lively in the mouth. There is some plushness as well, and really pretty silky tannins, and then nice acidity on the finish. I should also mention that we've been farming the Winderlea Vineyard Biodynamics since 2009, and we've been certified since 2015.
That's wonderful. And your first vintage was in 2006, was it not, Bill?
That's right. Yes.
That's fantastic. And how was this in terms of since you have this lighter style in this wine, what do you attribute that to in this vintage that seems to have a little bit more of that like structure and sultry, voluptuous sort of wines that, which is a blanket statement across the board, but what are you attributing to some of those lighter characteristics that you're getting in this wine specifically from this vintage?
I think a lot of it is us adapting our farming and our harvest decisions. So I'm sitting outside. I'm sitting in this room on Zoom with a bunch of very experienced winemakers. As you noted, we started in 2006. And, since we get just one shot a year, we make incremental steps towards defining our style. And especially since we started farming biodynamic and certified the winery biodynamic, there were very few tools left in our tool belt. And so the things we need to do to create the kind of wines we have to do have to be really driven by the decisions we make. So during that time, since we started farming biodynamic in 2009, we've been picking earlier and earlier and earlier, to the point now where on average, we're picking 5 to 10 days earlier than we would have picked in our first handful of vintages. And so I think we don't get quite the ripeness, we don't get quite the phenological developments that I think we would have seen in prior years. If I think about this and say 2008, 2006, our first vintage, which had pretty similar growing degree days, this is very different stylistically than that 2006 vintage.
Awesome. Great description of the wine. Thank you for submitting this. This is Winderlea's lot number 23, 5-case lot on its own roots from the Dundee Hills. Thank you, Bill. And now we're going to go over to our friend, Mr. Andy McVayof from Dobbes. Hi, Andy. How are you?
Hi there, Jessica. Good.
Great, great. So this is the Dobbes lot number 26, 5-case lot called Our Dream from the Willamette Valley. And would you take it away, Andy, and tell us about your wine, please?
Yeah. Our Dream is named in recognition of a fantastic farmer that Dobbes Family Estate has been partnered with since 2006, Tom Simonet. And his vineyard, he and Tom's late wife, and he named their vineyard Nuestro Sueño, which means Our Dream. And they named it because they were focused on new opportunities. The vineyard was planted in 1981. And when Tom and his wife stepped in, they started changing things to make it better. The farm had been owned by two other families who had pretty much maintained it the way it had been since 1981. Wide rows, a different type of trellising, which was more common earlier in Oregon's wine history. But Tom and his wife stepped in and made things better. They increased density, they narrowed the rows, they broadened the variety of clones. And Tom's dream is really similar to the winemaking dream at Dobbes Family Estate, to focus on improving and recognizing new opportunities. Dobbes Family Estate works with 12 different Pinot Noirs from the Willamette Valley, but we also work with Grenache Blanc, Syrah, and Viognier from the Rogue Valley. And we really like the Our Dream of the Oregon wine industry. And Tom Simonet's vineyard was really special for me to be able to highlight this year, because it felt such like a renewed focus of improvement and new opportunities. So the 2018 Our Dream Cuvée is 90% Tom's Vineyard, and the other 10% extends the floral components of the wine. And so like rose and loganberry and lilac, which I always get. Tom's Vineyard is from the Eola-Amity AVA, and that vineyard, that growing region, has a lot of non-fruit complexity, which I think is essential for classic Oregon Pinot Noir. It's easy to make Pinot fruity. It's easy to make it oaky. And unfortunately, there's a lot of wines that are very oaky, but it's hard to make Pinot with non-fruit complexity that comes from the AVA. And a lot of people get that through whole cluster. I didn't use that here, but the Eola-Amity AVA has a lot of spicy brambly characters and a darker toned floral component like lilac. And I really like this wine for the non-fruit complexity, especially the floral component. There's a little bit of oak there that adds a little bit of nutmeg and vanilla spice, maybe a hint of cedar, but there's a wide range of dark and red fruits. The red fruits are more typical of a cooler vintage, and the dark fruits are more typical of, I think, the growing region and Tom's Vineyard in particular. So I was really after making a very complex wine by recognizing the assets of the vineyard and digging into extending them through a little bit of blending.
And when was that vineyard planted, Andy? When was that vineyard put in the ground?
1981 was when the vines were first planted, and it's a small vineyard. Also, this is really important in Oregon's wine history. I think as Oregon gets bigger and more efficient and more broadly planted, there are still some real hidden gems of 16-acre vineyards, small vineyards, less than 20 acres that are owner-operator. And Tom's investment really shows when he's the one driving the tractor. He's the one making the farming decisions. Of course, he has assistance with the more hand-driven labor of pruning and leaf pulling and harvesting, but he's out there and he knows his vineyard very well. And I think many people get into viticulture and winemaking because they want to understand what they're doing in the vineyard and how that has an effect in the wine. So it was planted in 1981, and Tom's taken it a long way. And it's a small vineyard, and it shows all of his care.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And the Dobbes estate was started in 2002. Is that correct? That was the first vintage?
Yeah, there was a transition between 2002 and 2003. 2003 was really when things got underway, but we've been working with Pinot Noir from the Willamette Valley, but also Syrah and Viognier since the beginning, since 2002. And it's a really fantastic investment in diversity and Oregon's entire story.
Wonderful. I think that, one of the things that I think this auction really does well is it really does frame that camaraderie that we have, that community spirit that we have in all things in our region, which I think you've got one of the pioneer framers in front of us with Dave Adelsheim to put this together and really come together and do something good for our community and also for beyond our community. So it's just an auction, I think, is another excellent example of how we do that as a group and how we work together. Julia, do we feel like are there some questions that we can?
We got some really good questions in registration, and if you don't mind, I have one actually. This is for any or all. But one of the things I find myself talking about a lot when I talk about Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, two things: ageability and vintage variation. And my question for these fascinating winemaking lines here is, how much does the way that you make wine for ageability change from one vintage to another, if at all? And what goes into that? What is the intentionality of making wine that's specifically age-worthy? And I guess, I'm interested in that through the lens of vintage variation, and particularly with this vintage.
Who wants to tackle that one to start? Anybody?
We should let Jessica decide.
Why don't we, Drew, why don't you weigh in on that, and then we'll kind of go around and touch base on that a little bit. I think it's a great question. Okay.
As far as, obviously there's a tremendous amount of vintage variation, in the Willamette Valley, which is one of the beauties of making wine here, is there's so much personality to each individual season. In terms of different choices in my winemaking, in warmer years, the key is to find restraint and tension. I overuse the word tension. That's probably the fifth time I've said it so far, but it's the concept that really drives the way I want to approach extraction and harvesting. But finding restraint in warmer years, and then pulling back from how far the wines could go, either by your harvest decisions, but also by your vinification temperatures and choices of cap management, to find balance there. And then in cooler seasons, how to try to emphasize, what's lovely about those wines in terms of purity and length and things like that. So in warmer years, higher amounts of oak clusters sometimes, and sometimes some of the more difficult picking decisions occur in warmer seasons, where the numbers become a little bit unhinged from it. You have to base it even more than ever on flavor, phenolic development, and setting the stage for the one you want to make.
Excellent. And I think this is a really great, the way that this lineup shook out, we really have a variety of nested AVAs. So we have from Chehalem Mountains and Dundee Hills and Yola and Yamhill Carlton AVA. It's a really neat diversity. David, how do you want to answer Julia's question in that framework?
So I think, much of the first part of the answer is a repeat of what Drew said, because I think the variation within the Willamette Valley is so vast And related to soil type, sure, but not just soil type, it's also related to geography and mesoclimate differences. And so much of this variation is barely understood. And certainly in the Shala Mountains, we're desperate for more research on where soils actually begin and end, because we have 3 major different soil types. And also the understanding of what's the difference between grapes grown at 250 feet and 850 feet or 1,050 feet. I mean, you're picking at a different time. The temperatures in the 30 days from Verizon to harvest, or whatever the number of days may be, varies in temperature depending on elevation. So there are just mammoth differences in what you could do. The thing that is amazing to me is that because we have worked so closely with each other and for all intents and purposes stolen all each other's best secrets, it's really allowed us, the industry as a whole, rise to a very high level, both in terms of grape growing and winemaking. And so from a consumer standpoint, there's huge trust of what it means to have a Pinot Noir from the Willamette Valley. You may not know the brand, you may not know even the nested AVA that it comes from, but knowing that it's Willamette Valley, you have incredible faith in what this wine will be like, and that you will be very happy with it, because it will not be hugely overripe, it will not be hugely underripe, it will not be hugely oaky, it will not be forced in a direction, because the overarching thing that we all as an industry are looking for is our vision of what balanced means. Balance between all the elements that are in the mouth, but also balanced in the nose, so that you're not just smelling fresh fruit, or just smelling whole clusters, or just smelling barrels. So I think the combination of huge variability of vineyards and huge coalescence around winemaking and vineyard activities has raised the level of what we do to an extremely high level.
Excellent.
I answered a different question, but I liked it.
I like it.
It's great. That's a great answer. It's a great answer. And Bill, would you care to touch base on the same question?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I think one of the interesting things that winemakers have to do now, I think we all like wines that are age-worthy, but we all have to sell wines that are ready to drink on release, right? And so it's, David was speaking earlier about balance, and I think that's one of the things we all have to balance every vintage. I think, we're convinced that the fruit from our estate vineyard will make age-worthy wines, because I could take 5 steps from where I'm sitting now, and there's a bottle of 1999 Adelsheim Goldschmidt Vineyard, which is our vineyard, which is still drinking beautifully. And I've had Elk Cove wines from the vineyard from the 80s, and they were still drinking beautifully. So I kind of go into the endeavor expecting that the wines are going to be age-worthy. We love acidity in our wines, and I think we feel like that's going to be the structure that we're going to hang everything on. And so for us, it's now, how do we get the wine to a place where we feel like in 2 or 3 years when we release the wine that it will be ready to drink. And so much of that for us is about building mouthfeel. It's about the post-fermentation, maceration, to get that little bit of plushness, that little bit of structure, so it feels like it's ready to drink right away, and not just some glass of fruit juice that's that we put in a bottle.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Andy, how about for you?
Right on. Well, I'm going to approach this a little bit differently with a food science background and a little bit more of a technical consideration of wine. I think about ageability being tied to tannins and acid. Tannins are what require aging, and acid is what allows aging. Acid keeps wines fresh and youthful as they age, as the tannins soften. And when I look at the wines that I make in the vineyards that I work with, it's not so much an interest in making the wine more ageable, but find more age-worthy or age-requiring, but finding the AVAs in the vineyards that provide those components naturally, and using them to blend age-worthy character into vineyards and wines that are softer and ready to drink sooner. And I see age-worthy characters, especially coming out of the McMinnville AVA and the Eola-Amity AVA, which McMinnville AVA, the vineyards that I work with are higher elevation and in cooler sites. Van Duzer corridor that comes in through the Coast Range that influences the Van Duzer corridor AVA and the Eola-Amity AVA and the McMinnville AVA definitely can make wines more age-worthy. And the vineyards that I work with in the Dundee Hills and the Chehalis Mountains AVAs tend to be softer tannins and ready to drink sooner. And there's exceptions certainly, and winemaking styles that can make those wines more sturdy and more tannin driven. But I look for tannins to require aging and acid to allow aging. And the McMinnville AVA and Eola-Amity AVA and Van Duzer corridor AVA are great sites for sustaining tannins as grapes get ripe. And I look to the Dundee Hills and the Chehalis Mountains AVA to provide tremendous silky mid-palate weight and really more red fruity dynamics. So tannins and acid are what require and allow aging.
This seems to be the consensus too, just from what I've been tasting, and I think just overall is that this really has, this vintage is very versatile. And I think what's going to be important to the audience as well is, and I'm sure you've been tasting some 18s on the market, but you know, I think that from the feedback that I've been talking with everyone is that there's a lot of sultriness and voluptuousness to the wines, and a lot of structure, but there's also this really fantastic framework of acidity that's going to carry them through. And so I think they'll be upfront for the consumer, will be very robust and voluptuous and mysterious, but they'll also have this ability to really go the distance. And so I think this really is a wonderful vintage that we're just so proud to represent. So thank you for those responses, guys. Julia, what else do we have in terms of questions?
Yeah, so this is another one from registration. If you were to, that I'm adding to, because there's another component to this that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. If you were to take, you're teaching a seminar to consumers and you're teaching a seminar to the trade, and they are guaranteed to take away one piece of information for the rest of their lives. What do you want them to understand about Willamette Valley Pinot? Is it the same thing for both groups, or would it be two different things, and what are they?
Let's see, guys. Let's start with Mr. Adelsheim.
Nice, thanks.
Tough one.
Having thought about this question for hours and hours now, I guess it all comes back to what makes the Willamette Valley unique. And although you could point to a range of human attributes that I think are unique in the Willamette Valley, I think the most important thing that we can point to really is the cool climate, particularly in that period between Veraison and harvest, which I think has always defined the style of wines that we make as being different from most New World Pinots, because if you're minding your P's and Q's, if you're not just waiting lazily around for grapes to get overripe, you make in the Willamette Valley wine with great acidity, great freshness, and great backbone. That, as Andy suggested, is a big piece of why our wines age so well. And I don't think there's anything that's more overarching in importance, either for consumers or for the trade.
Excellent. Bill, do you want to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, actually, I have one thing to say, which would be for both consumers and for trade, and that is that the Willamette Valley punches way above its weight in terms of value. And I think that, if you compare the Willamette Valley to any other great Pinot Noir producing region in the world, we make wines that are as good or better than anywhere, and usually at a much more moderate price.
Excellent. How about you, Andy? Would you like to touch base on that?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, and it makes me think of what has made Oregon special from the very beginning. And I think in the wine industry and in the artistic community, people talk a lot about passion. I'm rebranding passion. I call it emotional investment. And I think what Oregon and the Willamette Valley is founded on is folks who are emotionally invested in what they're doing. I don't think that we're founded on folks who saw a guaranteed success, the best return on investment, and a pre-paved path to success. Mm-hmm. But we were founded on folks who were enthusiastically emotionally invested in what they were doing because they saw a connection between art, science, and agriculture, and they put it all in. And Oregon and the Willamette Valley always puts it all in. And we are kind of founded on, and on the other side, let's say a bunch of crazy people who are super excited and super invested in making the best possible out of really tough circumstances. And I think Oregon is very well trained and well adapted to doing the best in challenging situations. And whenever someone is emotionally invested and focused on quality, you're going to get incredible things. And that's what I like to tell people about the Willamette Valley.
That's awesome. I think there's also, there's such a connectivity to the land for everybody that I have been lucky enough to encounter who works in this region. And the spirit of stewardship is so alive and well. And, and I've heard many times that this is a place that Pinot Noir wants to be great and can be great. And I think we make absolutely world-class wines, and it's so important that we have these voices that go out and talk about that as a community. I think that's fantastic. And Drew, would you care to comment as well on Julia's question?
Sure. Well, to echo what you just said, Jessica, I think that the suitability, the ideal, the fact that this valley is basically potentially, is the ideal place to make Pinot Noir in North America and is capable of producing wines. It's something I tell my staff that works for me in any given year is that what's on offer for us as we farm our vineyards and get a chance to make these wines. What's on offer is to make one of the finest examples of our category on the planet. That's what's on offer. It's possible. That's how suitable this region is. But I think the takeaway I would want consumers or trade folks to understand is we're only 55 years into this experiment here. We're moving fast and adapting and evolving a lot, but the diversity that exists within this valley, the overall suitability, I think, is a settled fact. The diversity of this valley that has emerged over the years with the original 6 sub-AVAs from 2006, 3 more over the last few years, and quite a bit more to come. And the geological diversity of this valley that's a lot bigger than a lot of people realize. Some of Oregon's best vineyards haven't even been planted yet, let alone had their reputations established. So I guess we want people to understand that diversity, dive into it a little bit if they can, and stay tuned because the progress we've made is very rapid, and I think that's going to continue.
Thank you, Drew. There was actually a question from the chat that asked about the ageability. Is there an AVA that would have longer ageability than another? Is that something, or would you say it's site by site, or is it vintage by vintage or vineyard by vineyard? So would you guys touch on a little bit, basically kind of building off this same concept? Is there a nested AVA that has more ageability than others? And Drew, would you care to kind of start from there since just touch base?
I'm going to say no, just so there's no strife on this call, because I think there's too much of a range of style and site, and even within individual appellations. David spoke to the quite the range of different soil types existing in his primary AVA. I think the same is the case in really every AVA except for maybe Ribbon Ridge, which is more uniform. Even Dundee has an entire slice of it that is not volcanic and has a very different profile. So I think there's probably too much range of site and terroir and then winemaking on top of that. To pin it down to individual AVAs, it would come down more to not just site, but site and choice in the winemaking. Was that vague enough? I think that was a non-answer answer.
No, I think
on purpose, right?
I think you nailed it. But those choices that each winemaker makes, I think makes a huge decision, or makes a huge influence on that. Bill, would you care to touch base on that a little bit too?
Yeah, I would. Andy mentioned the McMinnville AVA in one of his earlier answers, and we farm the Meredith Mitchell Vineyard in that AVA, and it is dramatically different than our home site in Dundee, I think, in terms of ageability. I remember when we started farming that vineyard, Frank Mitchell told me that he takes the wines from that vineyard and he puts them in his cellar and he doesn't look at them for at least 5 years. And I think that's probably pretty good advice for a lot of the wines that come out of that AVA.
Excellent. How about you, David?
I mean, there are things that we can say, not necessarily about an AVA as a whole, other than really Ribbon Ridge, which is so small that you can actually speak of it as a place that produces a single, at least wines with the same nose and the same tannin profile. All the other AVAs, as Drew was saying, and as I said before, are much more complex, and you can't speak of them as a single place. I think, I know within the Shayla Mountains, we're looking at defining the neighborhoods that exist here and trying to nail down what the nose and tannin feel of those neighborhoods is, because those are things that a series of vineyards have in common. It isn't just vineyard by vineyard. But to do that for the whole Willamette Valley, or even the North Willamette Valley, is such a momentous undertaking, particularly because so many potential vineyard sites haven't been planted, haven't been, I mean, going up the mountain, going around the mountain. I mean, all the things that global warming will bring on us, we haven't dealt with yet. So you could define, if you had a lot of devoted work, you could define the nose to expect in a neighborhood, or the way the tannins would work in that neighborhood. But then to expand that to ageability adds a huge human element. How much new wood, what kind of and length of maceration, and particularly post-fermentation maceration did you do? What was your pressure regime? All these things add some element to ageability, not to mention what was the bottling pH, what was the relationship between acidity and tannin going in the bottle. So
excellent. And you had also kind of been an architect of looking at and protecting those agricultural areas in the early days of this, and really identifying topography and some of those sites. Was that in the 70s or 80s, David, that you guys really kind of took that to the Oregon legislature and made sure that those areas were protected agriculturally and reserved, versus becoming neighborhoods and things like that?
Yeah. I mean, historically, the Oregon industry created what eventually became the big AVAs the Willamette Valley was defined by 9 counties, and Umpqua Valley was defined by 1 county, and Rogue Valley was defined by 2 counties. because in those days there was no AVA system. This was in 1977. When the AVA system came into effect in 1979, we slowly moved over to the federal system and got the larger AVAs approved before moving on to much smaller and much more compact AVAs in 2004 to 2006 and moving on. It was also administrative, not legislative. So
Okay.
this was done at the Liquor Control Commission, not at the legislature.
Excellent, thank you. And Andy, would you care to touch base as well on the early question?
Yeah, what areas are ageable? And I think there's some really consistent result that vintage variation is, I believe, the first thing that defines the ageability of a wine. That if you have a cooler vintage, you're going to have more tannin and acid, and if you have a warmer vintage, you'll have less tannin and acid. And like several other points have already been made, that winemaking influence can really change those things. Time of the pick, method of fermentation, temperature of the fermentation, enzyme use, whole cluster use, extended maceration, percentage of new oak, all those things really shift those things around. But first and foremost, vintage variation. If you have a cooler vintage, it's going to result in a more age-worthy wine, or maybe age requiring. And this question about ageability comes up a lot with consumers and in trade. And I think that this is really a personal choice, that if you like wines with less, like if you want to watch a wine age, you're going to watch the tannin soften. You're going to watch the fresh fruit intensity mellow. You're going to watch the non-fruit complexity and increase. The more earthy tones come through. So if you want age-worthy wines, you probably generally want wines with less fresh fruit and smoother tannins. There's always exceptions to that, but I think that any wine can be age-worthy depending on what you want out of it. And the wines with more tannin and more acid are going to stay more fresh for longer, or hold those primary components longer, and more structure and astringency longer. And so it's a lot of it is personal choice. A lot of it is knowing the winemaker and the winery. I think there are certainly AVAs that hold higher tannin and higher acid than others. And first and foremost, it's a vintage variation thing. In cooler vintages, you'll have more tannin and more acid, and those things will require aging and allow aging.
Excellent. I'm always reminded of the scene from The Jerk, where he's at the restaurant and he goes, "I don't want these old wines. I want new, fresh wines." Always reminds me of that for the ageability questions. And then, Julia, do we have some other questions that we can pepper for this group while we've got a few minutes left?
Yeah, I've got one more. I wanted to say quickly that, we get just as the WVWA, we get questions about what are the differences between the AVAs all the time. And when I first came to Willamette Valley in 2017 for Harvest, I asked our enologist at Alexandra, where I was working at the time, okay, so tell me, how do you know each AVA when you're tasting the Pinot Noirs? How do you know which one's which? She was just like, all right, wrong question, just right off the bat. If you're going to be living here, it's site, it's by winemaker. I could tell you by vintage. There are all of these variables, but I am not going to be able to tell you McMinnville tastes like this and Dundee Hills tastes like this. That's just not a thing. She's like, there are some generalizations you can make, but none of them are, this is what it tastes like, because there's just too many other things at play. And that's something that I always try to remind people of. Another question from registration that I think, could be answered in a few different ways. Where do you see the Willamette Valley in the next 5 years? What are the challenges you're worried about? What are the things that are really exciting you? And what conversations do you think we're going to be having?
Bill, would you start us off?
Oh, damn.
Sorry, Bill.
I will steer clear of the politics of land use. I'm sure David will be happy to do that. I think we're all adapting to warmer weather. And with warmer weather, especially on the West Coast, you're seeing higher drought as well. And so we're getting not only warmer vintages, but droughtier vintages. And I think those are all things where, you know, we're learning how to manage. On the plus side, I will say one of the great things that this warmer weather brings us is that almost every place in the Willamette Valley reliably ripens now, where 20 years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case, or 25 years ago. So I think that in the near term is something that's going to continue to be positive for us, that you'll be able to look for across the board in the Willamette Valley and find really nice wines. But we're adapting, you know, to those two issues, the warmer vintages and the higher drought.
And Drew, what do you think about that? I mean, are you feeling like you're going to see things that are higher elevation plantings? Are there thoughts about, you know, changing rootstock from, you know, is that something that has to be thought about, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I certainly love working with higher elevation sites, and for the most part, I do for Chambers and for the other projects I'm connected to. It's certainly, I mean, it has its risks, but a high risk, high reward approach has always, I've always been happy with it. I'm not a gambling man, so I do it in this context. We take our risks in one area. So I think that certainly the move towards higher elevation, but you know, we've also had cooler and wetter seasons. You know, then there's been more variation, maybe even in recent. I think maybe the exciting takeaway I mean, rootstock is kind of obviously a geeky subject, but an important one, and one that we certainly make choices on as we replant, as well as kind of suitability for which selection of Pinot Noir we do, understanding, you know, why is it that certain selections of Pinot Noir work so well with certain rootstocks on certain soil types, and we're really just getting into that level of detail, and then adding the diversity of plant materials. I'm getting to work with 4 or 5 or 6 different selections of Pinot Noir that were either unheard of or impossible to get a decade ago, as well as is growing some of those on sites that weren't planted 20 years ago. So I think there's an expanding range of what's going to come from this valley, not just because we're getting better and digging deeper, so to speak, but also that we're being presented with other opportunities to expand the range. Excellent.
How about you, Andy?
Yeah, next 5 years in Oregon, I think changes. I like all the points about climate change and rootstock and soil type and elevation and site of new vineyards. I think a hot button topic right now is investment, and I think in Oregon's near and long-term future, there's going to be a lot more investment in large and small-scale winemaking, and that is just fine and good. The more, the farther out Oregon wines can reach, and the broader recognition we can get is good. So I think there needs to be a little bit more wine out there to share with other folks, and larger wineries can play a role in that. And smaller wineries are never going to go away in Oregon. Like I said before, a precedent that's been set here is for independent voices who want to do their own thing, and there's a lot of that in Oregon. So Oregon is going to get bigger and smaller simultaneously, and I think that's great. Climate change and warmer growing seasons is pushing vineyards to higher elevations. There's vineyards at 1,000 feet generally weren't a priority for the Willamette Valley, but many new sites are going in at 1,000 feet, and cooler sites as well to kind of mitigate that warm growing season. Sites with water availability. Bill mentioned that these drier vintages are significant, and I think volcanic soils that have higher water retention capacity is good for establishing young vines in dry farming situations. But if you're not on a soil with high water holding capacity and you don't have water rights, it's going to be tough, and there's going to be more straws sucking out of that aquifer below us. So I think sites with good availability for water is going to be significant. So We've got an investment of large companies and small companies making Oregon bigger and smaller at the same time. A switch to likely, and we're seeing this cooler sites, higher elevation, north-facing sites. There's a lot of north-facing vineyards going into the Dundee Hills. Many of the south-facing steep slopes are occupied, so we're rolling into north-facing sites. And I think the recognition of the Van Duzer Corridor AVA is significant. That was kind of a valley floor growing region, more typical of grass seed farmers than grapes, but and working with a significant amount of land through Wine by Joe at Seabreeze Vineyard, 214 acres, we've seen that vineyard come in more and more beautifully as the vintages get warmer and warmer. The Van Duzer Corridor effect from the ocean is significant and like clockwork, and I don't think eventually the ocean may get warmer, but that cooling effect is going to be consistent. So cooler sites, water availability, large and small investment, those are all things happening in Oregon right now.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. And David, would you mind commenting and closing up our panel today?
Yeah, just ripping off of what Bill said. I listened into a panel, I think it was last Saturday, and Etienne de Monti was asked a similar question about global warming. He said, well, we have to admit, frankly, Burgundy up to today has largely benefited from global warming because it basically has meant that we don't have bad vintages anymore. And I think the same is true of Oregon. I don't know that we've had terrible vintages in a long time, but certainly the likelihood of having a vintage like a 1984 coming back today is just off. It's not possible. But the point about Burgundy also brings up another point, and Bill, although you won't wade into the land use question, I think there's another political question that does have some import, and that is to call a wine Burgundy, you've got to bottle it in Burgundy. You can't take the grapes to southern France and call it Burgundy. And frankly, right now, if you go into a grocery store in many parts of the country and look at where the wine was bottled, even if it says Oregon on the front label, it often says California on the back label. And that has some real, not only is it taking jobs and grapes, but the more important issue is that a wine bottled in California or in any other state using Oregon grapes doesn't have to meet our strict labeling laws. It's as if it was perfectly legal to take Pinot Noir grapes from Burgundy to, let's say, Switzerland, bottle them, use the name, use the reputation, but not have to do any of the things that are required under the AOC laws in France. And I think that if it is allowed to continue and to grow at the rate that it's grown over the last 10 years, will pose an incredible level of doubt in the minds of consumers as this becomes obvious to them that Oregon wines are much more variable than they once were.
And that's always been a priority for this group of people, is to really elevate to such a level that keeps the standards as high as possible and to hold everybody accountable. So I think that it absolutely plays into exactly what the foundation of this was when it started. So I think that's a really great point, David. I think this was a fantastic panel. You guys, thank you so much for being so candid and presenting your wines. And I'm just honored to be here with you. Thank you so much. And Miss Julia, would you take us out?
Yes, thank you so much to our lovely moderator and wonderful panelists. Folks, I'm going to drop some resources in the chat right now. If you are a consumer and you'd like to learn more about the auction, got resources there. If you are a member of the trade and you have not yet registered to bid, please do so at that link. We hope to see you next week, August 11th, 12th, and 13th, with a live close on the afternoon of August 13th. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, attendees, and we'll see you at the auction. Cheers.
Auction. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.